Oh, hi. You got me rereading some classic John Byrne stuff. You know, John Byrne's art, I remember it as being pretty awesome. And a lot of it is. Except then I came across how he drew these kids. Or these kids. And that was enough to start me questioning myself. Was there a point where John Byrne's art fell off?
Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. You know, I grew up reading a lot of comics from the 80s, so whenever I hear the word superstar in the world of comics, the first name that comes to my mind is John Byrne. Thanks to his detailed artwork on hit titles like X-Men and Superman, at one point John Byrne was just the name in comics. And of course, he still has a passionate fan base. But from 1981 through 1983, I will argue that he made some changes to his art style, as well as making some comments that irritated some of his professional colleagues that potentially halted his career from reaching even further heights. So that's what I want to talk about today. The rise and arguably fall of John Byrne's art career. Before John Byrne broke into comics, he attended the Alberta College of Art and Design with a goal to become a commercial artist. He enrolled in 1970, and it's worth noting that he created a comic strip for the school paper called Gay Guy. That was a comedy strip about a man named Gaylord who decides to fight crime and dresses up like a butterfly and carries a purse full of gadgets. The comic strip even included fourth wall breaking moments like the superhero elbowing a bad guy across a panel border, material that Byrne would later revisit decades later on his acclaimed She-Hulk run. While the Gay Guy comic plays into stereotypes, it's also an example of an openly gay superhero over 20 years before Marvel's character Northstar declared himself openly gay. And it's worth noting that John Byrne co-created Northstar in 1979 and intended the character to be gay, but Byrne has said editor Jim Shooter would not allow characters to be portrayed as openly homosexual. In the 70s and 80s, John Byrne did a good job adding some diversity to comics, including creating characters like Puck. Byrne published 13 of the Gay Guy comics, and also self-published ACA Comics Issue 1 in 1971, all while still in college. He left college early in 1973 and had a fan art piece published in Marvel's official fan magazine, Issue 14 of FOOM. It was this piece, showing the various Marvel characters created by Jack Kirby. By the following year, 1975, Byrne began getting regular work at Charlton Comics with some of his most memorable work including his Raj 2000 stories about a robot that was published as a backup story in the pages of E-Man. According to John Byrne himself, he broke in at Marvel Comics when writer Chris Claremont saw Byrne's work at Charlton and eventually got him a job drawing Iron Fist with Claremont writing after artist Pat Broderick blew a deadline. Claremont and Byrne formed a great collaborative team for 15 issues of Iron Fist, which included the introduction of the villain Sabretooth, and of course, they went on to have their epic run on X-Men. In between, they also did a Star-Lord story in 1977's Marvel Preview Issue 11, which paired Byrne up with inker Terry Austin. I found a great source of interviews with John Byrne to be the Two Moros Publishing Modern Masters book about him. And in that, Byrne talks about a lot of his influences within comics, guys like Neil Adams, Steve Ditko, and Jack Kirby. And yet, I think John Byrne clearly has his own visual look. At the same time, there are some clear inspirations that he pulled from Jack Kirby specifically. I think that there are examples throughout John Byrne's career that show how influenced he was by Jack Kirby. In Iron Fist issue 7, Byrne illustrated a fight sequence using a 9-panel grid of punches and kicks that was reminiscent of the layouts Kirby had used in Fighting American number 3, Two Gun Kid number 62, and Tales of Suspense number 85. Byrne drew a splash page for Captain America issue 255 that's a clear homage to Jack Kirby's original cover. Byrne brought back Jack Kirby characters at both Marvel and DC, like Agatha Harkness and OMAC. He had a sequence in issue 244 of Fantastic Four where the Human Torch is flying after someone and flames out in the upper atmosphere, just like Jack Kirby did in issue 5. These and other examples are too specific to be coincidence, in my opinion. Kirby was a direct influence. Nevertheless, John Byrne forged his own path as an artist and really came into his own as an artist on X-Men, starting with issue 108 in 1977 and continuing as the artist and eventually co-plotter with Chris Claremont for almost every issue through 143. Highlights include the 2-issue Days of Future Past story and the long Dark Phoenix Saga arc. Some of the characters in the X-Men book had been created before Byrne's run, but he really did make them his own. He grounded characters by basing them off specific people. For instance, the villainous Mastermind was an evil mutant drawn by Jack Kirby as a crusty old man. But John Byrne reimagined how Mastermind could make himself look to the rest of the world with his illusory powers, based on actor Peter Wyngarde. Wolverine had never been seen without his mask, but Byrne helped sell the idea of a surly outcast by using character actor Paul D'Amato as visual reference. Logan had unconventional looks that we're used to now, but they helped sell the character as memorable and new in 1977. Again, I just want to point out that I think Terry Austin's fine lines for the inks really aid in making it look new to readers. There had been artists that drew with great fundamentals like Alex Toth, or fantastic rendering like Neil Adams. But Byrne and Austin delivered a really detail-heavy art style that was a huge hit with readers and certainly inspired the following generation of artists at Image. All you need to do to confirm that Austin's inks were a huge asset is to look at the guest inks of Rick Viamonte in issue 118 to realize how much an inker is bringing to the table. John Byrne was clearly inspired by the artists that came before him, like Jack Kirby, and in turn, he went on to inspire the artists that came after him, guys like Jim Lee. He came into the industry at a fascinating period where artists were finally able to really sell themselves based on name recognition, and they were able to start fighting battles to get more and more creator rights. Which makes the 1980s comments that John Byrne had about Jack Kirby all the more baffling. A brief history lesson. In 1978, copyright law in the United States changed. Following this, Marvel issued Jack Kirby a new contract that signed away more rights than Kirby was comfortable with, and he left to work in animation. Both Marvel and DC had begun to return original artwork for new comics by 1976, but Marvel still held on to thousands of original pages of Kirby's artwork, and once he left, Kirby began calling for Marvel to return his artwork to him in interviews and at conventions. Many high-profile comic book professionals rallied around Kirby's cause, including Frank Miller and Will Eisner. But not John Byrne. Instead, John Byrne wrote an editorial that was published in the January 1981 issue of Comics Scene magazine. In part, he wrote, quote, "When a comic pro creates a new character or any other such merchandisable commodity, it belongs wholly and solely to the company. This is true of every extant character from Superman on down." Byrne continued by talking about Superman's original creators, Siegel and Schuster, writing, quote, "On a purely human level, were Siegel and Schuster entitled to their pensions? The answer is yes, of course. But on any other level? Sorry, but the answer is a fat no. They may have been two little dumb hicks from the Midwest, unfamiliar with the machinations of the publishing industry of the late 1930s. They also were creators of the single character on whom the rest of us have created an entire industry. But the fact remains that the character had been generally rejected, the Bell Syndicate said it had no lasting appeal, when the infant DC took a risk and bought the idea from Siegel and Schuster. And don't be fooled by the paltry sum they were paid, generally reported at something under $200. That was a lot of money in 1938. The editorial also included this piece, which rankled many fans and pros alike when Byrne said, quote, "I know I have, of late, taken on the mantle of a company man, and in many ways, I am deserving of the title, even proud. I am a cog in the machine, which is Marvel Comics, and I rejoice in that." One response to that appeared in the comic Destroyer Duck by Steve Gerber and Jack Kirby, designed to raise money for Gerber to get the rights from Marvel for his character Howard the Duck in court. The book included the villain Booster Cogburn, a satire of John Byrne who had no spine, could not be destroyed, and was a proud company man. Despite always having strong opinions and not being afraid to voice them, John Byrne's artwork spoke for itself, and he continued to have a lot of success. Following his run on X-Men, Byrne took over writing and drawing Fantastic Four from 1979 through 1986, and I will argue it is at least in the top 3 runs that title has ever had. I want to mention that I'm not really addressing John Byrne's writing in this video, which I think is uniformly strong. I'm talking about some changes to his artwork when the style became a bit simpler. And I think that happened because at a certain point he went from being just the penciler or the penciler and co-plotter in the case of X-Men to a point where he was writing, penciling, and inking on Fantastic Four on a monthly basis. And that is a lot to do on a monthly basis, even for somebody like John Byrne, who I will point out at one point had 4 monthly comics that he drew the interiors for at Marvel. Wow. Yes, in the summer of 1980, there were issues of Uncanny X-Men, Captain America, The Amazing Spider-Man, and Fantastic Four that were all penciled by John Byrne, which is an amazing accomplishment. But they also all featured inkers, respectively Terry Austin, Joseph Rubinstein, Gene Day, and Joe Sinnott. Very talented individuals. But right after John Byrne took over writing Fantastic Four, beginning with issue 233, he also took on both the penciling and inking duties. That is a lot to do. Early issues, however, were clearly filled with passion, as Byrne gave it his all. These were clearly characters that he loved. But if I put an early issue page beside a later issue page, you can probably see a bit of a difference, and I think I found about where that changed. These are pages of issue 265 of Fantastic Four, featuring Paste Pop Pete breaking into the superheroes' headquarters. Backgrounds are intricate, and there are often about 6 to 7 panels per page, with establishing shots and smaller inset panels to help guide the reader through the action and story beats. Issue 266 was largely done by a fill-in artist, Kerry Gamble. Then look what happens when we get to issue 267. Many of the pages feature very simple backgrounds, often just plain walls with a few lines to indicate corners. Some of the establishing shots are clearly photostat copies of New York City or something similar, which I'm not complaining about, but I'm starting to see less detail. Still, it's not radically different than what I'm used to. There's some good character work on faces, hands, some exciting action scenes, but where Byrne may have used a 9-panel grid in his earlier days, or at least a mix of establishing shots and smaller close-ups, most of the pages now feature 3 or 4 big panels with a lot of open space. Moving forward, the next several issues have similar layouts. And to give Byrne some credit, he can be very good at using negative space or deep shadows. His cover here for Spider-Man in his black suit is iconic. The final page of this issue of Fantastic Four, revealing Invisible Woman has just had a miscarriage, really drives the moment home. Although I can't really get behind the 5-page fight scene in Alpha Flight issue 6, where Snowbird fights the embodiment of winter across 5 pages that are completely white panels. Points for creativity. But a similar example that I think worked better was his comedy run on She-Hulk, where she tore through a comic and walked across ads. Not a lot of new art, but it really worked great there. I'm getting off track. My point is that Fantastic Four continued to simplify at this point art-wise. Issue 270 has a splash page of people sitting in an apartment that strikes me as bland. The line weights on the wrinkles in Alicia Masters' clothes is really not much different from the outlines of Alicia herself, which are about the same as Johnny Storm in the background. There's not a lot of variation. Backgrounds are much simpler, and most pages only have about 4 panels. It isn't bad storytelling, but the illustrations themselves are less engaging, at least in comparison to some of Byrne's earlier work. I do think that there are later highlights in his career. For instance, I do think that Byrne's 1986 run on Man of Steel, rebooting the character after the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, is a step up over the last third of his Fantastic Four run. But after that Superman run, I just didn't see Byrne trying that much that was new with his art. He dabbled in creator-owned work, making Next Men at Dark Horse from 1992 through 1994. But mostly, he bounced around Marvel and DC with a similar art style to his last third of Fantastic Four. By the 2000s, he was working on licensed books like Star Trek and Angel. For someone who had been working professionally since 1975, John Byrne doesn't have a lot of extended runs for the second half of his career. He quit She-Hulk after 8 issues, quit the Hulk after 6 issues, quit Indiana Jones after just 2 issues, quit his West Coast Avengers run right in the middle of a story arc he'd created with Scarlet Witch as a villain. His Wonder Woman work for DC in the 90s ended when he heard that the editor, Paul Kupperberg, was moving on, and Byrne did not want to risk working with an editor that he didn't like. The stories in Wonder Woman do feature some of John Byrne's worst tendencies in terms of trying to retcon things back to an era that he personally liked, such as Donna Troy here becoming the original Wonder Girl again. And he did some experimentation with CG backgrounds that I don't think match tonally. Of course, it's not as bad as his later photo comics that he made for Star Trek, but that's a whole nother story. I have no complaints about his writing on that book, but the art of this era is my personal least favorite. Wonder Woman was very inconsistent. He did stay on that for almost 3 years, and he also did nearly 2 years on an X-Men book, but that was set in the past, fitting stories into the middle of what already existed. John Byrne seems to like to be able to do his own thing, but also didn't seem to have much interest in making original creator-owned comics. Since 2018, he's been penciling some X-Men fanfiction with the idea that the book continued from where he left the title after the Dark Phoenix saga, but with his ideas. It's an interesting experiment for sure, but not something that I've been excited to keep up with. I will say that the fact that John Byrne is making X-Men fanfiction just for himself does prove to me that he sincerely loves drawing and that he loves making comic books. All I would argue is I wish I had seen more creative breakthroughs from Byrne like I saw with X-Men, Superman, early Fantastic Four, She-Hulk. I know that John Byrne can do superhero melodrama standing on his head. There's no question. But he did do a little bit of other things. For instance, he co-wrote the first Hellboy story arc with Mike Mignola. I would have loved to have seen what John Byrne might have done on stuff like Pure Crime or Pure Horror. Maybe it would have pushed him to new creative heights. I don't know. I do admit that John Byrne was the top guy in comics for at least 20 years, and that's a huge accomplishment. I just wonder if there was an opportunity for him to potentially push himself even further into the stratosphere. But let me know in the comments if you think that I'm way off base with that assessment of when his art style changed in Fantastic Four, or if you think that the John Byrne of the current day is a different beast than the John Byrne of the 1970s and 80s. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll be back very soon with more comic book analysis, and until then, I want you to keep reading comics. Take care. Hey folks, thanks for watching. This was definitely a tricky episode for me because I do have some sentimental feelings towards John Byrne's work. It was some early work that definitely excited me, and at a certain point I just sort of realized that I was being a little let down by the art. It's hard to describe. It's an emotional response, and your mileage may vary. I totally don't blame you if you've always loved his work or if it didn't speak to you. I just sort of went on an arc, and so this essay was me trying to talk about that. I've always tried, whenever possible, to separate the art from the artist. Mostly I can do that. The essay itself earlier in this video, I didn't really address it a lot, but John Byrne has definitely done a lot of controversial things. Supposedly, for instance, he was really into the underage Kitty Pryde romance with the adult Colossus, to such a degree that editor Jim Shooter did some things to put the kibosh on it when he wrote the Secret Wars miniseries. He tried to separate them. That's a little creepy. John Byrne has said some really unpleasant things. For instance, Jessica Alba's cast as Invisible Woman in Fantastic Four back in the day, and Byrne said that blonde Latina women look like hookers to him. That's not exactly very sensitive. It's not talking about somebody's acting ability. You're just talking about their looks. I don't think that's necessarily the kindest way to approach it. And he's also had some weird things to say about immigrants in general, just being ungrateful. And you can even see an early inkling of his thoughts on that with his Superman run.